Warning, censorship. Warning, censorship.
NoCovidJails.com. That website is dedicated to our fight for the travel and mobility rights of all Canadian citizens to be able to come and go as you please, to enter our country as you please, especially when they are completely healthy. Now, you can read this whole appeal for yourself. Frankly, it's not all that complicated. I didn't have trouble with it, and I'm a non-lawyer. But largely, our arguments hinge on the ruling where the judge said, quote, there were no reasonable alternatives to preventing the introduction or spread, end quote, of COVID-19. It's official. Rebel News is appealing the decision of the federal court to keep Justin Trudeau's illegal and unconstitutional COVID jail system firmly in place. Our incredible lawyers from JSS Barristers filed notice of appeal on July 7th. Yes, friends, we're headed back to court and we absolutely must do this. I'll explain to you in a minute why it's so important for us to appeal this judge's decision. But first, let's go back a step. Let me give you a little background about what's happening here. As you know, last month, Rebel News was in court, actually federal court, in front of Chief Justice Paul Crampton. We were arguing that the COVID incarceration program, the COVID jail system, where perfectly healthy, innocent travelers are subjected to being detained against their will in a COVID isolation hotel while they await the results of a second COVID-19 test upon arrival to Canada, even though they have to have a clear COVID-19 test to get on an airplane to come back home. And these international travelers are often billed thousands of dollars for their brief stays in a mid-range hotel. And then after they get the results of their second COVID test, healthy or not, these people have to go home and quarantine for 14 days. So the question remains, why couldn't they just go home in the first place and quarantine for 14 days? Why do they first have to go into a jail system and be billed for it? And then there's the most ridiculous thing in all of this. The jail system is just for healthy or those who present as healthy at the airport. If you show up at the airport after you land in Canada from your international flight and you say, I have a fever, I've got the sniffles, I'm not feeling well, you get to skip the COVID jail system and go straight home to quarantine. You don't have to be incarcerated at the COVID jail. They don't want you there. Now, at Rebel News, we had a journalist who used to work for us, Cian Bexty. We sent him to Florida to cover a story for us there. And when he came home, he was taken into the COVID jail system upon arrival in Calgary. Cian obviously could have just went home in his own vehicle that he had at the airport, where he would have been exposed to nobody except his partner that he lives with. But because he was taken directly into the COVID jail system, he was then exposed to numerous other strangers. And when Cian was released, he still had to go home and quarantine at his own house for 14 days anyway. None of it made sense. Now, our lawyers from JSS Barristers made some very compelling arguments in front of the Chief Justice. But, as you know, judges are political and they don't want to be the one that ruffled feathers and ruled against the liberal establishment. You don't exactly get invited to the fancy parties that way. So on June 18th, Chief Justice Crampton ruled against our application for a judicial review of the COVID jail system. But we are, as I said, officially appealing. Here's our notice of appeal. Now, the notice of appeal is 5 pages long, and our lawyers from JSS Barristers have meticulously laid out the arguments for our grounds to appeal this decision. You can read it all on our special website, NoCovidJails.com. That website is dedicated to our fight for the travel and mobility rights of all Canadian citizens to be able to come and go as you please, to enter our country as you please, especially when they are completely healthy. Now, you can read this whole appeal for yourself. Frankly, it's not all that complicated. I didn't have trouble with it, and I'm a non-lawyer. But largely, our arguments hinge on the ruling where the judge said, quote, there were no reasonable alternatives to preventing the introduction or spread, end quote, of COVID-19, besides detaining international travelers for 3 days in government-authorized accommodations. We think sending people straight home would have clearly been a reasonable alternative. And in the case of our journalist, Cian Bexty, who is, as I said, taken into the sausage maker of the COVID jail system, had he gone straight home, he would have been exposed to fewer people. Now, another one of our key arguments is that the judge said the detention of completely healthy Canadian travelers was not arbitrary. We think that it was completely arbitrary to detain travelers who otherwise have an appropriate quarantine or isolation plan and who won't use public transportation to get home, to be detained for 3 days, like I said, healthy or not, and then be released to go home to quarantine for 14 days anyway, when they obviously could have just went straight home in the first place in their own car, which at the end of your whole government airport abduction ordeal is the end result. None of it makes sense, clearly. Now, here's the reason why an appeal is just so important and so necessary. The judge's original decision to deny a judicial review of the COVID jail system is now being used to further shoot down other legal challenges to the COVID jail system. This 170-page judgment was cited as a reason that a different judge ruled against the Canadian Constitution Foundation just days ago in their own legal challenge against the COVID jail system. That's why this judgment, as it is, cannot stand. It lays the framework to further infringe on Canadian civil liberties and further denials of challenges to the COVID jail system. It's got to be overturned. Can you help us? Fighting for civil liberties for Canadians, for the rights of perfectly healthy, innocent Canadians to come home, to leave or to stay within their own country is a protected charter right. It's not supposed to be unreasonably infringed. Challenging this decision in the Court of Appeal is going to cost another $60,000 to $70,000. We've already spent $200,000 fighting this COVID jail system so far. That's over $250,000 just to fight the federal government to try to stop the illegal and arbitrary incarceration of innocent Canadian citizens just trying to come home. But we think it's worth it because what are the civil liberties of 34 plus million Canadians worth these days? If you think it's important to defend civil liberties every single day, but especially during a pandemic when the government is using the excuse of an impending emergency to take your rights away from you without any real recourse, please help us in this fight. You can donate at that website I mentioned earlier, nocovidjails.com. Friends, we're up against the entire federal government, which has unlimited resources to fight us. But we have something they don't have, and that's you. We have people who care deeply about human rights and safety and freedom to just move around and be Canadian. Again, our special website is nocovidjails.com. We have to do everything we can to make sure this decision does not stand, even if it costs in excess of $250,000. For Rebel News, I'm Sheila Gunn-Reid. If you'd like to help us fight Justin Trudeau's unconstitutional COVID jail system in court, please donate today at nocovidjails.com.